Emma, good evening. Thank you for joining us. This is Emma Haughton, ladies and gentlemen, the author of this book, Daar in English, Donker in Dutch.
How do I say that in Dutch? Donker.
Donker. Exactly, that's it.
Oh,
Did you
that's
practice,
probably the first words in Dutch I've ever uttered.
Well, there you go. Well, one of the most important words for you in Dutch, I imagine, the title of your book. Congratulations! We used the English cover, but it's of course in our title, but we love it. It looks amazing.
I think I prefer your version of the title to ours, actually.
You do, yeah.
Nicer sound to it.
I'm sure it sounds a bit more exotic.
Yeah.
To introduce you to our audience this evening, could you tell us a bit about yourself, what you did, because this is your first adult thriller. What did you do before you started writing this book?
Well, I can't claim to have had quite an illustrious career as Samuel. I basically went to university. I travelled around a bit, then I went to university, and then I was a journalist for 10, 15 years working for national newspapers here in the UK. And I started writing, well, first of all, the first thing I ever wrote was a picture book, and then I wrote some thrillers for young adults, which were published, so 3 books there. But this is the first adult thriller that I've written. So I've basically just been writing most of my life in one way or another.
Yeah, and I read in an interview that you when you have children, when they were younger, you started writing children's books, and you sort of followed their age.
I've progressed up with them from picture book, exactly, tiny little babies, right up to when they were teens. Not that they generally read my books. My daughter has. I've got 4 children, but one of my sons has read The Dark now. But I think that's the first any of my 3 sons have ever read any of my books. So.
Well, maybe they're old enough now to read this one. But what can you tell us about Donker? What's the story?
What can I tell you? Well, it came about when I was having a rare night in on my own. My husband was away on business, and I watched a documentary about the British Antarctic Survey built a new ice station out on Antarctica. It's a really amazing looking thing, sort of like a giant red and blue caterpillar. And I was absolutely entranced by this, but not only the ice station, but when they started to describe what life was like for the scientific teams that go out to Antarctica. I think there's about 50 ice stations in all, lots of different nationalities. But they quite a few of them keep a winter crew to keep the station going over winter, and they were just talking about how this new station would be cut off for sort of like 8 months of the year. No, and a lot of it, at least 4 months, in complete 24-hour darkness. And my writer brain just sort of went, well, what could possibly go wrong? And sort of, it just seemed like the most perfect scenario for what we call a locked room mystery, you know, a thriller where you've got a group of people and something happens.
First it was the setting, and then you asked yourself, what could happen, there, and then you came up with the story. Is that how it went?
Yes, and then I sort of started reading more into what had happened, and some quite crazy things have gone down in real life in Antarctica. I think 2 years ago, a Russian scientist stabbed the welder at the ice station because apparently, I mean, this is the most hilarious bit, over book spoilers. The welder kept giving away the plot lines to the books. The scientist was reading, so he just completely lost it and stabbed the guy. So,
it's a bit harsh, but we sort of sympathize, right? I mean,
exactly. What's worse than having your plot spoiled by when you're in the middle of reading a book, you know?
Exactly, and I can only imagine that they would have a small library over there, so there's only so many books you can read during those times. Yeah.
So perfectly understandable that you would stab someone under those circumstances.
Yeah.
But seriously, I mean, because it's dark for so long, they're completely isolated. You can't get help in or out. I mean, there were years ago, one Russian doctor had to take his own appendix out. That's how isolated you are. and another American doctor had to treat her own breast cancer because they simply couldn't get her in or out. Apparently it's easier to get someone off the ISS space station than it is to try and rescue someone from Antarctica in the middle of winter. So if you think about that level of isolation, then you've got that darkness, and that really messes with your body rhythms and how you react, and you're stuck in this sort of isolated group of people, and tiny arguments like overbooked spoilers can flare up into, you know, quite big incidents. So there's just huge potential for things to sort of
clearly
get
yeah.
a bit out of
And
control.
what is the story you came up with for the book?
Well, I don't want to book spoiler my own book, but,
I know it gets out of hand. No, but
but basically, when my character Kate arrives out on the ice, she's a replacement for a doctor who's already died out on the ice in what is assumed to be an accident. And she comes onto the ice station with a small group of people, about 12 other people, and everyone's quite uptight and traumatized. And it gradually unfolds from there. She starts to sort of dig down and try and find out what's happened, what happened to the other doctor, and then things progress on from there.
It's a small thing, but your character's named Kate North.
I know.
Head south.
And yet she's in the south.
Or not?
Go figure.
Was
Kate South didn't have the same ring to it, really, because we always associate extreme cold with the north somehow, don't we? Especially in Northern Europe. But of course, it's very, very cold in the south in Antarctica as well.
You just mentioned that you've been writing most of your life, basically. Where did your passion for writing and telling stories come from? How did that start for you?
Well, I was never one of, you know, I used to enjoy writing poems and things when I was a kid, but I never sort of wrote books as such or stories. I just assumed, actually, because I studied English at Oxford, and you study the great writers, and I just assumed that it was completely out of my reach. So I never plucked up the courage to start writing till quite fiction as such till quite late in my career. I mean, I wrote a lot of journalistic pieces, but it took me a while to think, well, maybe I could do this.
Well, I can imagine that the grades might come across as a little bit daunting, but did you have any books that were an inspiration? You think, oh, this is the kind of stories I want to tell?
Goodness, that's a question. One book that made a big impression on me was Miss Schmiller's Feeling for Snow, Peter Hoeg. I'm probably not saying that right, but I really enjoyed reading that. And I've always enjoyed stories about cold climates and the north and so on. And I suppose in terms of thriller writers, just many of the classics, really. I really enjoy Val McDermid. I'm trying to think off the top of my head. I've always read and enjoyed quite a lot of thrillers, and my YA books were thrillers as well.
Yes,
because
that's true.
I just like stories where you feel a real compulsion to carry on turning the page and find out what's happening. I like stories that raise a lot of questions and have a lot of pace to them.
Well, it certainly works in your book, that's for sure.
Thank you.
I have a couple of questions from the audience. George is asking, do you have any advice for people who are writing their first thriller?
Goodness me, do I have any advice? My advice would be to plot it out quite carefully, because I think thrillers in particular, say, compared with just sort of more literary fiction, have a lot of twists, and you're trying to do various sleights of hand and hide things from the reader. So personally, I find to plot it out quite carefully initially, and also to constantly think in terms of questions. What questions can you pose in the reader's mind right from the get-go? So draw them into the story, make them curious as soon as you can, really. Yeah,
and because it is very important to know while writing where you're going, where you want to end up at, right?
Yes, Well, yes, it does help. Although sometimes your brain surprises you, so it will just, you think you know where you're going, and then suddenly, oh no, something else is going to happen. So you have to go back and, you know, work out how that will spin out in the story.
Right. And there's a question from Jacqueline. Now you've written your first adult book. Are you going to write more books for adults?
I think so. I think so. It's actually quite, in some respects, a lot easier than writing for young adults, because in young adult novels, if you've got a teenage protagonist, it's quite hard to get them away, say, from their parents or authority figures, so they can be proactive within the story. So of course you don't really have that problem with adults, so it's a lot easier in that respect. And
yeah,
you don't have to mind your language so
much. You told me once that at first you thought it was the other way around. You thought writing young adult books would be easier, actually. But
I did. To my shame, I actually thought, well, that would be the easier way in. More fool me, really.
Well, no, it's just interesting how that goes, and how you only when you start writing something you realize what it takes to do it. No, but actually, I think you're already working on a second book, right?
I am. My editor said we want something in another interesting location. So I thought, well, there's the rainforest, but I've never been there, and I'm certainly not going. And there's a desert. So I have actually been to the desert out in the United States. So I'm setting this book will be set in a very remote location in the northern Mexican Sonoran Desert. So lots of heat and snakes, things like that.
That's a great setting as well. Do you find that it's easier to write, or do you write better when you know the what you're writing about, the locations and stuff like that?
I think the biggest challenge for Donker, well, I'm trying to say that right, is that, I mean, obviously it's very, very difficult to go there, especially during COVID time when I was writing it. So I had to rely a lot on research. And luckily, a lot of people, it's quite a privilege to get a placement out there. So a lot of people did blog and write about their experience of going out for the winter. So that was great. I mean, obviously in this instance, I don't have to do quite so much research about the exact conditions. I'm a little freer just to use my imagination.
It's just very hot out there. That's the gist of it, basically.
Yes, very hot.
Yeah.